My name is Simon Davies. I'm a business psychologist by background, specializing in selection and assessment predominantly, but I've done a lot of leadership development and personal development as well, professional development. I've been very fortunate. I've worked with a lot of different organizations, both public and private. It's an incredibly interesting line of work that allows us to do that. But my home really is in the kind of the assessment things. I've got a particular sort of interest in helping graduate students find early careers work. So after over 10 years of working in this industry, I have no idea where the time has gone, but I decided to sort of go independent. I've launched my own company called Merio Talent, where we specialize in merit-based hiring, and we're supporting graduates and current students, school leavers and apprentices, and connect them with meaningful employment as best we can. We know that the market out there is incredibly taxing, obviously something we're going to be talking about, but doing what we can to try and support, really passionate and high potential individuals find work, and kickstart their careers.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So that leads us nicely on into the first topic, which is AI, which is quite topical actually in graduates. We did an event last June where we had Dr. Bertie Muller on there, who is a professor of AI at Swansea Uni. And funnily enough, he was saying that it is quite heavily used by graduate applicants. And so I wondered, based on that, did you have any thoughts around AI and how it's being used potentially by different age groups or different seniorities entering the market?
Yeah, I mean, AI is a classic sort of umbrella term, isn't it? It's a suitcase term upon which you can sort of pour everything into it. When we talk about it from a kind of a candidate side, we're almost invariably talking about ChatGPT, either kind of the free to use or the paid for or subscription model. There are, of course, other tools out there. I appreciate any sort of experts in AI listen to me say that, probably sort of head in hand with me reducing it to just that. But in the main, when we talk about the kind of the access to AI that just is sort of the average person, not to be insulting, has, we are talking about ChatGPT in sort of generative forms. I do think it has caused quite a stir, in that it has allowed individuals to really neatly curate the kind of the CVs and the cover letters and things like that, which is proving to be a real sort of stumbling block for a lot of organizations, and it's proving to be a bit of a headache for hiring managers. Now, I run the risk of kind of losing friends and alienating people when I say this. I do think that the introduction of AI does give us a moment in time, an opportunity to stop and reflect, because I was listening to Arctic Shores, Robert Neary were talking about the kind of the different elements of assessment throughout a process that would be most at risk, and I agree with the research, which is it's things like the application forms, the open questions, why do you want to work here? I refer to them as kind of fealty statements, cover letters, that type of thing. But the thing is, we've known for a long time that this isn't a particularly good way of doing things. It would be, in an ideal world, it'd be lovely if a candidate could sit down and take their time to write to you and tell you why they're interested in the role, what excites them, and the match between, as they see it, between them as the candidate and your company. The reality, of course, is very different, and candidates are applying for dozens upon dozens, hundreds upon hundreds of roles just to remain competitive against their peers. So things like asking for cover letters that are, written from the ground up and bespoke, things like curated CVs, things like answering long form questions. There's nothing worse than applying for a job you're not even sure you want to apply for yet, and it giving you a 3,000 word text box saying, tell us why you want to work here. Well, the reality is I'm not even sure I want to yet. So these kind of things have been an issue for a long time, and ChatGPT does threaten the legitimacy of those types of kind of approaches. So, it's a good opportunity to take pause and think, how can we actually do things a bit differently? How can we revise our approach? And if we don't move, we're just sort of, it's kind of this battle of attrition in terms of just diminishing efficiency in our process. If every single candidate is just putting their CV, putting the job description into ChatGPT, and taking the output, pasting it into whatever application form you've got and submitting it, you may get hundreds, thousands of applicants, and they all kind of look and sound the same. And I was looking at some research earlier today, and it just seems to be the case. So it gives us an opportunity to pause. I do think there are some real advantages to it, but there's certainly some challenges that come with it as well. I hope that answers your question. Sorry, Kate.
Yeah. Oh, it brings me on to a couple of others actually. So I know you mentioned it's a lot in those initial stages. So the CV, the cover letter, really curating those for the company. So because we developed the technology as well, we've looked quite heavily into how candidates are using it as part of the assessment process. And technology, like you said, is developing, and you're able to get tools now which can help during the actual assessment process. So perfect. It's almost goes without saying that no one really reads a cover letter anymore, like you say, because candidates can curate them so well that most of them read quite similarly anyway. But now we're seeing that AI tools can creep into the assessment process itself. And so we can put sort of mitigations in place. So one of the things that we tend to talk about quite often is, do you think with AI through assessment processes is something that actually we just need to accept is part of day-to-day life now and will be used by candidates? So do we just level the playing field and say, right, it's going to be used. So actually we will flag where it might have been used just in case not everyone is using it? Or do you think we try and put blocks and barriers in place?
Yeah, I mean, I actually I agree with the former in that I don't believe that you can sort of block it, and I think, as I said, it gives you the opportunity to take pause, to restock, and think about your approach. It reminds me a little bit. I saw a great post on LinkedIn actually. Somebody had shared a picture of from decades ago, a picture of a teacher with the classic sort of 2x4 wooden thing with a sign attached to it, and it just said "Teachers Against Calculators." Because of course, when the calculator was introduced, it was this sort of nascent technology. Teachers and educators were terrified that it would reduce a student's ability to comprehend maths. Now, are they technically right? Yeah, probably. We probably aren't held to the same mathematical standards as we maybe were 50 to 80 years ago or more. But do we need to be? And I would argue not. If that technology is in abundance and it can be used. Then that's the way the world goes. And I think with AI, I have seen some individuals, I'm always happy to listen to diverse opinions. Some have said, this is going to be absolutely calamitous and we have to kind of, put the brakes on it immediately. But I don't believe you can. I don't think you can force the genie back into the bottle. What you can do is you can adapt. At the end of the day, generative AI is a tool. And if an individual is going to use a tool, that's wonderful. It depends to how they use it. We've seen loads of examples where people have used it terribly. They've just copied and pasted something into ChatGPT. They've not even proofread it themselves, and they've just kind of submitted it. Well, I'm not going to confidently turn around and say we can spot that, because I don't believe you can. It is quite tough. But what you can absolutely do is still encourage applicants to combine tools with their own creativity and their own ingenuity. But you've got to build it and you've got to incentivize it in your assessment process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, interestingly, you saying the genie is out of the bottle. It's exactly that. People are almost using it day to day now. In that event I mentioned last June, it was actually discussed that technical sort of developer roles, they're encouraged to use ChatGPT and AI tools, because actually, if you have the skill to be able to use the tools well, that's the skill in itself to be able to get the output that you need. So
yeah, exactly.
It goes to, it ties into a topic that we'll talk about later around hiring to future proof. And actually, it's probably quite true that a lot of the roles that will exist in 10, 20 years time, because of the technology that's developing, don't actually exist yet. So those new graduates, like you say, coming into the market and utilizing the tools are probably building skills that will be really useful in those 10 to 20 years time. So argument is, on the one hand, is it slightly unfair during the assessment process, or are you actually just utilizing tools, learning how to use them so you can be a better asset to a workplace further down the line?
Yes. Yeah, no, you make a very good point. I don't believe that we should ever be trying to just stop the evolution, the natural sort of progression of skills that are required. And you're right. I think when I worked in my former employer, a company by the name of Modern Hire, they were really pioneering kind of AI technology in pre-hire assessments, an American firm, and we're really sort of close to things like legislation in AI and things of that nature, and wondering how best it can be kind of used. But they didn't shy away from it. They didn't fear it. What instead they did is they worked out how can they use it most effectively but most fairly. So if we've talked about it from the kind of the candidate side, but from the client side, from the hiring side, what can we do to use AI effectively and fairly? Well, we described it as kind of picking up the heavy lifting. So automate the process where you can automate it, streamline it. So if you imagine that kind of candidate funnel, you've got huge amount of candidates at the top where the funnel is loaded. If you can reduce that number down fairly but quickly, and with sprinkling of AI and automation to help with that, to facilitate that, it then frees up your time at the other end to do the face-to-face stuff, which is really important.
Playing devil's advocate on that, sorry to interrupt, is then, do you think that we might miss potential candidates if we rely on AI to do sifts, and if we automate processes using AI? Sometimes if we accidentally remove the human touch at the wrong time so if we used AI as a standalone, we might actually lose good talent during the process, which then makes it harder for the hiring manager.
Yeah, I mean, maybe accused of having my cake and eating it, so to speak. But I agree with you. I think the operative term there is the appropriate use of it. And we have seen, without naming names, we've seen some horror stories with the way in which AI has been misused, things like facial recognition and things like that. We know that it's in an inappropriate use. But what I would be keen to do is, one of my motivations for founding Merrier Talent was to bring it all the way back to the actual early application. So one of the major problems with AI at the moment is it's been used to really exacerbate the actual the physical clicking of applications, where people can develop and design sort of programs that help them mass apply to lots of different jobs that really they're not actually looking at. They're not looking at the job description. It's compounded by automated tools. I hate to say it, but like LinkedIn one-click apply, what it's done is it's increased. It's that classic law of unintended consequences. You introduce something to help people, but ultimately, when people are, generally speaking, there is an element of desperation in the market, because it's not a great market for employees at the moment, and they've got my sympathy. But when you're in that situation, you just apply for things to try and increase your chances. And when I worked out, so the last company I worked at was Hayes, and we did some great live in-person events. We talked to a lot of candidates, and they just said, I'm feeling like I'm hearing nothing back from these big jobs boards. I'm applying, and my application just seems to be dropping into the void, I think was the language that one person used. But if you've got a job and there's one opportunity available, and then people are using things like one-click apply, and the volume of applicants has gone from, say, 30 people who have carefully read the CV now to 5,000 people who have automated it and they've just clicked. Yeah. You've got a very real problem that needs to be solved way before you even get into looking at candidates. So I think it's actually introduced a big stumbling block. I saw this. It made me chuckle. Which when you're at work, it's important, but to enjoy what you're doing. But it was a picture of somebody taking like hand soap, the little dispenser thing. They'd taken that with the kind of thing, and they just stuck it into a block of hard soap, and they said, that is ChatGPT, that is generative AI to a system that has already got problems. Adding a new technology on top of an existing technology where there isn't that compatibility is a problem. And we're sort of seeing that at the moment. A lot of the recruitment partners that I've talked to personally, it's inundated with applicants, and the quality has gone down, not up, just because of the sheer spread. Yeah, anyway, I'll take pause there. I'll stop monologuing.
No, it makes complete sense, and it ties in really, really nicely with actually what we do at Tazio, which I know from your previous conversations, we work really hard to create products, technology, software that actually streamlines that recruitment approach. And because there is such a high volume of candidates that lots of employers see now, it's about making sure you find the really good talent amongst that without sort of taking away that personal touch. So, like you say, using automations and communications tools just to make sure that actually you are reaching out to candidates constantly, because it is an awful market at the moment, and lots of the time poor old candidates are left sort of weeks without hearing anything, which can be demoralizing. So yeah, I completely agree that actually technology needs to improve that, not hinder it, and just add to it. So it's on the point you made, Soil, will probably bounce back to AI sort of afterwards. But you mentioned a really key point about the market at the moment, and because one, AI as a tool is causing a huge influx of applications which might not be hugely relevant either. But then you've got the added issue within the market at the moment that unfortunately we are seeing lots of redundancies, lots of political factors, shall we say, impacting lots of business decisions, which is meaning that there is an influx of talent within the market. So those application volumes are just going to get higher. What are your thoughts on actually whether or not that one will flatline, let's say, so it will sort of even out and we won't see such an increase? Or do you think that that's going to continue over the next few months? What are your thoughts on the market at the moment?
Yeah, it's quite a. I try not to be the bearer of bad news. It is fairly bleak at the moment, and I think what needs to be done is, the organisations will of course operate in their best interests, and they'll reevaluate, and they'll be sort of reevaluating to what extent individuals need to be taken on. The world of work is changing so much. I mean, there's so many. I mean, for a long time, it's been known that the average tenure at organisations might be a year to 2 years for people, but if you go back 50 years or more, I'm not sure that was ever the case, and people would take people on at a junior level and work them through to more senior positions. And I dare say, I might cause some frustrations with people listening to this, but just a priori, I mean, it feels like that option to take people through would be a much cheaper alternative, instead of this kind of endless sort of job hopping that we all, myself included, find ourselves engaging in. I do think, you mentioned sort of political factors, and I know that a huge amount of change has been influenced by the American elections. It's that classic thing, if the Americans cough, we all catch a cold. And in Europe, it's always the way. And so, things are changing, and there will be a lot of volatility. I think for individual candidates, obviously, all of this can feel quite depressing, but I think that what we can do as recruitment partners and talent acquisition specialists is try to work out where we can iron out some of the major issues. We spoke a moment ago about candidate ghosting still exists, and that to me is, I don't want to come across as some sort of saintly figure, but I find it just incredible that is still so prevalent with people submitting CVs. They're going to a lot of effort to submit CVs and just hearing nothing back and being told that's the way it is. And it's perplexing to me that more can't be done to sort of aid in this. I don't blame recruitment teams because they're getting reduced down. They're getting scaled back all the time because, again, you mentioned sort of redundancies and things like that. I've known teams of 20 and 30 internal recruiters that have been reduced to 2 or 3. What are they to do when those kind of redundancies are announced? But I think what we can do is be far more precise in the jobs that we're putting out there, being far more targeted in the way that we reach out to candidates, and give them a clearer understanding of actually what the opportunity in the role requires. Because I think we've lightly touched on it, but something that I found in founding Merrio Talent, where we frequently aggregate roles. We look at some job descriptions and they are like War and Peace. And you read it, and I hate to say it, but it's some of them, again, without naming names, they feel like a politician's teleprompter. It's a way of saying a lot without really saying anything, and that seems to be quite common. I don't think this helps anybody when they're trying to choose their options and get into work. So, sorry to be so bleak, but when things do get tough, I think we need to go straight back to basics and then really try and help connect people. Let's say if I view it through a graduate lens for a second, the bit that I'm most passionate about, how do we connect the elements from school age, things like industrial placements, apprenticeships, connected to graduate opportunities so you can move the person through. And overall, it should help organizations maintain top talent instead of having to announce these huge redundancies at the drop of a hat.
So there's a couple of key topics here. So tying into things we've spoken about just now with AI, we've got AI is potentially causing complications not only for the market, because one, employers are seeing a huge influx of applications, plus you've got redundancies, which is increasing that. So you've got a problem for candidates because they are in a very competitive market going for job roles, plus employers are then having probably more applications than they will have seen. And like you say, if they don't have the technology set up, or they don't have the process set up to be able to work through those applications effectively, then that's going to be problematic for both sides. I think one of the interesting things as well is that everything is so interlinked. So we've discussed that between AI in the application sense and how the technology uses AI from both sides. But then you've also got companies, whether or not it is hiding behind AI for the redundancies, but you've got people like Meta recently announced a high number of redundancies and said that it was for the development of AI. And then you have other companies who are potentially making people redundant to save cost and then trying to fill those roles with AI. So AI is, whilst it is a great tool, do you think it's also being, trying to reassess this question, whilst it's a great tool, do you also think that it's potentially developed so fast and we've used it in so many different ways that the market potentially isn't ready for it yet?
Yeah, I'd certainly take your point. I was listening to earlier today. Actually, I was listening to it's a Substack podcast by Charles Hanley, who's a psychologist in the US. He actually had Ben Williams, who's obviously very, very well known in the UK psychology space, talking about this very thing. And I love the phrasing. The current AI that you've got is always the worst AI that you've got. Of course, it's constantly evolving. No matter how fast it's evolving, that statement holds true. Really like that idea. And, we are seeing rapid improvements in AI, things like hallucinations, which is a really big issue. You pop something into an early ChatGPT model and it will, I might ask it to find me 5 studies to help me with a project I'm writing that prove X or confirm X, and then it will just launder studies into existence that don't really exist. Stuff like that is reducing quite rapidly, and it's getting more reliable in that sort of sense. But I think it's changing rapidly. But I still see, when I go to sort of like talent events, conferences, and things like that. One of the things that got me, I can't actually remember the source, but it was a majority. I think it was in the 60 percentile plus, or percent plus of companies. They were keen on using and adopting AI where they weren't originally, but for no specific purpose. So it's kind of that classic case of, what do we need? AI. What do we need it for? Don't know.
Yeah.
But we need it. And it's like, okay, great. Maybe we need to drill down on exactly what it's going to provide for us. I must admit, again, I'm sorry to sound a little bit bleak for a moment. I do worry about sort of entry level and more manual workers. I was reading an article about, trucking in the US is one of the biggest employers. If you find a way, might not be able to now, but if you find a way in the next 50 to 100 years to automate that entirely, that is a heck of a lot of people who are now without work. Do I think that there are going to be roles that are dedicated to AI use? Yeah, there absolutely will be, but it seems unlikely that the number of roles versus the number of people in existing roles that are potentially threatened, one certainly seems a lot greater than the other. But for now, I think the AI that we've got, I think it still requires a human element. It still requires people to be highly skilled in what they do, being very sort of almost complex. One of the things that we talked about quite a lot when we talked about challenges in the hiring market was we very quickly mentioned sort of the rate of change. In talent assessment and recruitment, we went from the kind of the Henry Ford industry line model where we need to hire a person to, I don't know, spray a car door. So it's this really tightly prescribed job, and all we need them to do is do it well and keep doing it. So, well, that's quite, in relative terms, that's quite easy to assess. We can box in all of the things that we need to assess, and then we just assess that and we're good. The modern role has evolved so much that we need somebody to be interpersonal, to be able to negotiate, to be able to present, to be able to analyze things, to be able to use code. And it just seems to be just compounding that effect, almost in a bit of a sort of Pareto distribution that seems to be doing that. But yeah, in short, to answer your question, I think it is increasing at a rate of change, but I think we're still in a period of, we need to understand what this is actually doing, as opposed to, say, giving into, there is a little bit of sort of fear mongering, I think, out there as well. I think we just need to be really clear on what its use case is, the so what, the why of any assessment or AI product.
Interestingly, on that it is still developing. AI, whilst there's loads of arguments that AI is going to take over the world, and we joke about that sort of thing. But it essentially is a learning tool. That's how it develops. It learns more. And there is the argument that if it was to be used within an assessment process, that because it is a learning tool, an original argument for using it was obviously we can mitigate assessor bias because it's not got that human bias that you might not necessarily know about. But if you train it through processes, could it potentially learn that? So actually, if it has a process that is picked up through this particular company or assessment process, could it actually be negative for neurodiverse candidates going through that process because it would have learnt that bias?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a completely fair concern. Our line in the sand when I worked at Modern Hire was that AI, when appropriately used, can be the solution to bias. If it's inappropriately used, it can be the cause, or it's certainly an exacerbating factor. And we've seen that with some of the early adoption, the kind of the formative years of AI usage. I mentioned earlier facial recognition, AI being used to assess candidate. I mean, I've seen it used for, I think, a team of German reporters, I think, sat down and looked at an AI tool that could infer Big Five personality characteristics using facial recognition technology. I was just like, I don't really, without being rude, I don't really understand how this approach even, passes muster, so to speak. Like you would never ask a skilled interviewer to pick up on facial expression and things like that and then infer someone's ability or characteristics or personality. You wouldn't do it. So why would you ask an AI tool to do it? I always likened effective use of AI to a highly effective intern. If you think about what an intern does, an intern takes again, we mentioned about sort of the Henry Ford model. They do a very tightly bound and prescribed job, and they do it over and over again to a really high standard. They don't make executive decisions, and ultimately they're always deferring to somebody far more experienced, a line manager or a director or somebody senior. If you can use AI in that way, and you always have that human intervention and that sign off, I think you're already making positive steps forwards. Worst case scenario, of course, is sort of black box technology. So if you think about sort of, we have to be able to look into the AI model or the AI product that we're using to be able to say, in the context of, say, a candidate assessment, a candidate has gone into this process, they've put one foot into this glass box, if you like. We can see how they performed, what we scored them against, and therefore the overall score we've awarded. And we have to be able to do it one way, and we have to be able to do it backwards. So that reminds me, when I first started in my career, I cut my teeth to doing assessment center delivery. And it was impressed upon us very early on, even when I was like a junior psychologist, that anything you write about a candidate, they are technically allowed to see.
They are.
Yeah, exactly. Now, not that I was going to be annotating and that's nothing like that, but it was just a very important lesson to keep your documentation, which is, you take full verbatim notes on what the person said. You score them against a pre-defined scoring criterion or matrix. And then as a result of A plus B, you get C, which is the overall score. But you have to be able to reverse order it as well. So someone goes, well, I got that score. Why is that? I goes, well, because of this. And you said that. AI technology, you've got to be able to do the same thing, basically. And with facial recognition technology, with some of the early forms of AI being used, it just wasn't. They were churning out scores for people, and no real understanding as to why. And then reporters then started to analyze this but look, I got this score, I took it again, and then I got that score. It's completely different. How's that the case? It's like, we don't know. So yeah, for bias, I think my approach, because the word bias as well, I think the problem with it is it's been a victim of kind of concept creep, and it's become this quite elusive term. So I would always just use it, and people are free to sort of disagree, but I would always use it to define sort of any form of proxy. So anything that is being used that ought not be used to infer somebody's ability to do a job. So a good example is, confusing confidence with competence. The confidence there, they come in really, very positive, very gregarious, very sort of bold. And you assume that means they're going to be good at their job. That's a proxy. It's a replacement for something you're trying to assess. Well, all you need to do, but what you should be doing is looking for where those proxies exist.
Sure.
And that's where you can reduce bias. So as long as you can demonstrate very clearly what you're trying to assess and when and how, then I'm not going to say we can remove bias entirely. I don't believe that, but I think you can just reduce it down as best as humanly possible.
So with that then, with your experience in your different roles and your background, what do you think the next 12 months will bring for technology being used in talent assessment?
Yeah, but I mean, peering into the crystal ball is an interesting one. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I was listening to, the rate of change is truly quite incredible. I will agree with Charles Handler, who was asked this very question on the podcast I mentioned a moment ago. Said that multiple choice questions and things like that, and some of the classic psychometrics, they're not going away. Say in the next 12 months. I don't really, but again, without naming names, I've seen some individuals sort of, I think they are concerned, and I completely understand the concern. They think that our form of business psychology, our way of life, is almost completely under threat in a very short amount of time because of AI. I don't really agree with that, and I just think we're going to be required to sort of modulate our approach. I know that Arctic Shores and a few others are very keen on scrapping the CV.
Yeah.
I certainly agree with the sentiment, but I think what can be done is that you can create better transparency around that. I think you can simplify. One of the things that we're working on at Merrio Talent is exactly that, is to create basic sifting tools that will just take objective data. So, I mean, I know that you and I, people who work in this space, we've been moving away from, you need a 2.2, you need a 2.1. The reality is we know that some organizations still require those things. They still require degree qualifications from certain certain degree types rather. Well, these are zeros and ones. These are things that you can sift on. So if you can bring it back to that kind of thing, you've got objective and fair measures at the start of the funnel where you can start moving things forwards. And I think we're going to see, hopefully, maybe I'm being obnoxiously optimistic, but I'm hoping that we can just return to seeing what is it that we require, this candidate to do the job, and then how do we assess that. We don't need to load our systems full of AI products if they're not helping. We don't need to be seen just to be using AI for the sake of it. We don't need to completely upend everything we're doing. One of the things I would be keen on us moving towards is a skills-based approach. I think that would be a much better way of going. Yep. And we've seen some incredible amount of change, but it's very early. I'm quite excited about it personally, but I think there's a long way to go, should we say?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it's exactly our stance on it. Is actually what we do is to put a process together that assesses the whole candidate. So, while some people might want that CV, actually, like you say, is there actually a necessity to have it? Because if you want specific things like a 2.1, or you want a specific qualification, a lot of it actually, rather than looking at where they might have previously worked, so you've got some brand names on there that could again link together with that bias that you mentioned. That's not necessarily a good indicator that they'll be really good in the role. It's actually putting them through an assessment process that assesses all the different elements of their personality, their skills, their aptitudes, and it shows not only whether they're capable for the role now, whether you fit with the company, whether you fit with the team that you're going to work in, and actually how successful you might be in the future. So that's exactly what our stance is as well. So it ties in nicely actually with our next topic, which is the future of work and how you prepare for that. So lots of technology, lots of changes in the market, lots of changes in the way people assess candidates. What do you think, and what are your current thoughts on actually what employers should be thinking about when looking at future-proof assessment and employment?
I mean, I was presented on this a few times, which was a piece of research by the information house Gartner some years ago. It was 2017, I think. They do incredible amounts of research into sort of the HR and talent space generally. They found that the kind of the number of skills that are found within the average job description was compounding, so it was increasing by about 10% year on year. And this is, I think, since 2017. I might be wrong on that, but it was the talent Gartner Talent Neuro, I think it's called, as a certain sort of form of research and product that they use. But fascinating, because it kind of goes back to that sort of thing I mentioned about Henry Ford. Sort of, you've got this year, way back when, really tightly prescribed amount of skills, and now it's just broadening and building and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And yeah, I think we're absolutely moving in that direction, where you need individuals that can demonstrate that, those sometimes referred to as soft skills. I know some people don't like that term because it's almost seen to dismiss them or diminish them. I don't mean it that way, but
no, they're vitally important.
Yeah, exactly. The interpersonal skill, the actual, hard skills, if you like. Let's just use coding as a quick example. But that type of thing, I think, is the right way that we should be going, if I can be so bold. And you mentioned already that kind of holistic approach to assessing a candidate. I completely agree with that. And I know why it's been so hard to achieve up till now, which has, of course, been technological constraints. If you've got thousands of candidates, it's quite hard to assess the whole person, if you like. But with innovation, I do think that we should be at turning our attention to trying to sort of supercharge the kind of the focus on that whole person assessment. But one of those big things has to be kind of attitudinal, I think. I'm not worried about the use of ChatGPT. I'm interested in understanding the way in which ChatGPT has been used in an application. Is someone using it? Again, listen to a few PhD psychologists who founded their own companies and they're incredibly successful. They said it themselves. I don't really do anything without bunging it in ChatGPT first. It's a good jumping off point, but that's all it is. It's a jumping off point. I'm not going to just take it, copy it, paste it without even reformatting it. But it's that kind of thing. We must look at attitude. We must look at interests in a given role, in a given industry, that type of thing. And I think is what I was trying to, maybe not successfully alluding to earlier, when I sort of said about bringing it back down to brass tacks. I do think at the moment we're in a period of we can't see the wood for the trees. And we've lost sight of what we're really trying to do, which is to assess an individual's ability to do a job well, but also their ability to stay and do future jobs. I think that's the whole argument for potential that we've talked about quite a lot before.
Yeah. So you also touched on the point of skills-based assessment, sort of in our previous topic and just now. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts on actually, because there's been a really big increase in lots of people using the buzzword. Skills-based assessment, and that they're moving towards that. But do you think that what lots of companies are doing actually is more competency-based assessments, just relabeled? And what would you actually define as skills-based assessments if you were to do it properly?
Yeah, so I agree, and I think it's where that natural sort of skepticism of mine tips into a small, healthy amount of cynicism. I think just a tiny bit, which Mitch. Is exactly. Just dip your toe in, so to speak. I was reading a piece by the Burning Glass Institute. And I think they did a piece of work in partnership. I think it was with Harvard Business School. It was February last year. And they looked at the sort of what they defined as a skills-based approach, which was in part, and not completely, but taking the classic sort of you must have X qualification and actually looking at a broad set of skills. They found that so few organizations were actually doing this. And when they crunched the numbers, they were finding it was not even being applied to like less than 1 in 700 hires in the US. And most organizations were using it in name only. So skills in name only. So we have a skills-based approach. Then you look at it and you're absolutely right. It's like a competency or something like that. I don't have a very fancy, nicely curated definition of what I think a skill is, but it's something ultimately. It's okay. It's something from a graduate to view it from a graduate standpoint. I think it's something that you can simply curate. I know that's a very simplistic view of it, but And of course, it does absolutely tap into various elements. I think one of the biggest problems we have as psychologists, business psychologists, is that we play a lot of sort of semantic sword fighting with certain concepts and terms. But a broader taxonomy, I think one of the problems we ran into in one of my former lines of work is it isn't a unifying, generally agreed upon skills taxonomy. There are some organizations that are investing a heck of a lot of money into trying to build this. Of course, as you can imagine, there's bleeding around the edges into competencies. There's bleeding around the edges into personality. If we think about, the 5-factor model of personality, a huge component of the sort of the extroversion piece is concerning soft skills. So I might have a psychologist after this maybe call me up and yell at me for that simplification, but we've got a kind of a constraint of language when it comes to skill. So we're going to have to invest a heck of a lot of time defining exactly what we mean. But I think as we're doing that, not once we've done that, because that's an ongoing thing, but as we're doing it, it would then be great to bring it back. And I think graduates, I'm showing my own bias here, but I think graduate hiring would be a very good way of tying those elements together. We know yesteryear companies hired from entry level and promoted internally. I mean, there are so many different pieces of research. I think The Guardian did this. I think they covered it. I think ISE covered it. CIPD. There's so many other organizations. Gartner, I know that I've just mentioned, Forrester as well. They all talked about younger candidates are fascinated with the idea of upward trajectory mobility. So I've never really liked this idea that younger people they don't want to sort of engage and participate. No, I think they want to, quite rightly so, they want to understand where this job can take me. And I think the way that the world of work, without getting on my soapbox too much, the current world of work isn't really nicely suited to that anymore. You get a lot of people who are going, I want to go that way because I'm passionate about my work, so I'm going to go to that company. Like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's. I think most people would love to join a company and be told, if you work really hard and you for 2 to 5 to 10 years with the appropriate skills, and you can learn these skills and you can have this internal learning if you're willing to work for it. I think that you'd see a lot more people sticking around. I'll pause there.
No, I agree, and it's almost like that. Almost like talent mobility as a phrase. I think we saw a huge increase in it around COVID. You had sort of the Great Resignation around COVID, when suddenly everybody was able to work remotely, which opened the doors massively. You weren't geographically restrained to where you could actually work. And so, like you said, people naturally have this want and this desire to progress in a lot of cases. And if you can't get that in your current role, it's a lot easier for you to be able to hop onto a different ladder where you can get a couple of steps higher at a time, and you can massively reduce the time you do it in. So it's a real temptation for people. I can.
Far easier to negotiate a higher salary because they are blind. The employer is blind. Whereas if you're doing it internally, you can't exactly bluff because they can just go, that's not true. What you're earning, for example. So you're absolutely right. I'm really passionate about that kind of thing. Because I think as long as you're prepared, I named Merio talent because of merit-based. I believe a merit-based approach which subsumes all of skill acquisition, the willingness to learn skills, the willingness to apply oneself and work hard. That's what I'm really passionate about. And I've seen it. I've worked with some really high caliber graduates, but they're not just academically brilliant, which has often been a gate. I think rightly, a lot of individuals who work in social mobility have kind of called that out and said that the reality is that just because somebody has got X qualification and from Y, it doesn't mean they're necessarily got the right attitudes and things of that nature. So really passionate about that kind of thing, but I don't think we're doing it, and it's a huge complex problem to solve. We can't just click our fingers and fix it. But that kind of ability to bring people through and upskill them, to go back to your point, is something that I think very slowly we should be trying to reconsider and reintegrate our approach towards.
So how do you think that's going to affect future workforce planning, for one, but the talent market secondly? So we've got a couple of points there. You've got one, that talent mobility between companies has increased. You've got the increase in candidates in the market and limited roles up for grabs for them. How do you think that is going to impact, one, how employers plan their workforce, and then two, how they think the approach of candidates is going to be towards that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question to unpick, but yeah,
sorry,
so
a couple in there.
no, you're fine. I mean, it's very interesting. I certainly going back to the piece we mentioned a whole lot earlier. Excuse me, about sort of economic and market conditions. I certainly foresee a fair few years of real caution on the side of hiring organisations. And as I mentioned earlier, I think in that period of caution, which is completely understandable, the sort of the economic condition necessitates it, I'm afraid, would be good to go back to the drawing board to evaluate and really consider who do we need to bring into organisations and where. It's interesting actually because if you can carefully curate your early careers and incentivize them to stay and engage in that development, you're taking individuals that will enter by definition on a lower salary, but then can be converted into, say, within an organization, a partner within 8 to 10 years who is turning over incredible amounts of revenue for the organization. If you carefully curate it, I don't think we're kind of there yet. I would love to see, and maybe I'm conflating what I think I'll see with what I'd love to see, a more careful sort of planning of workplace roles that integrates the early careers. I often see it's kind of separate. Very often it's tied to kind of EVP and almost the marketing of an organization, which is understandable. But I think there needs to be more of an effort to workforce plan and actually entrench the early career stuff in, so you can start seeing this upward trajectory for individuals. I hope that answers your question. I appreciate it was a multifaceted question, but
yeah, not at all. I think
bring me back on it. Yeah.
No, interesting point you made. So do you think that it doesn't necessarily need to be what we think will happen in the markets, but do you think a good place for companies to start is actually to reassess their early careers programs? Because one, they could, it sounds awful, but they will get more cost effective employment, but they'll also get graduates that are moldable to the company as long as they align with their company values. They've got the skills that we talked about, some of those soft skills, so they can actually really thrive in the workplace. That you actually could potentially have a better workforce in 5 years' time than if you were to go sort of for more senior hires.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm generalizing massively, but when the economy is in the situation that it's in, and organizations have to make these really tough decisions, but these tough decisions a lot of the time are reactive. We're seeing mass redundancies being announced seemingly overnight. Of course, there's been some planning behind the scenes, of course, not to deny that or dismiss it, but if you're being highly reactive, you're hiring for the now. We always used to, when we did things like assessor training and things like that and supporting some of our clients, we'd always talk about the need to step away from the warm bodies approach, which is we just need somebody in this seat now. That's all well and good in a very short time frame, but you should be trying to graduate and move away from that. So you're thinking more long term. But yeah, I think if you were to carefully curate your early careers approach, and just firstly start by defining exactly what you're looking for, what we need, which I appreciate is not going to be, it's not going to be an exact science. There's an element of art in there too. You're going to be able to combine quality with cost saving measures, that are actually going to provide to you returns on investment over the long haul. I think what we're weirdly seeing at the moment is a lot of our clients are actually reporting huge increases in applications, but the quality is not where they need it to be. Okay. So that implies there's a multifaceted challenge there that needs to be unpicked. And actually, a time of caution might be the best. When you're not hiring en masse, might actually be a better time to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. So I'm gonna pose again. I
was going to say, I feel a curveball coming on.
Not necessarily a curveball, but I wonder, taking into account that we've got so many different implications with a potential talent pool that you might have. What do you see happening, one, after April, when hopefully we see the dust settle slightly, and then towards the end of the year, what do you see happening in the market?
I mean, AI is not going anywhere fast. Obviously, its impact is going to be compounding, I think, and we're going to have to just try. I would like to see in the next sort of 6 months to a year to see more careful sort of consideration and application of AI in the wider talent market. So people are getting they're getting that clarity on exactly what it can and cannot be used for. Seen some elements of this. I mentioned Modern Hire earlier. You know, they used it. It's not seen as a new idea anymore. I know a number of organizations do it, but they used AI, for example, to accurately, you know, kind of use an NLP sort of style approach, natural language processing, to evaluate candidate scores and things like that. But again, working in a really sort of tightly prescribed way to help hiring companies do that. I think you're going to see more of that over the next sort of 6 months to a year. You'll see more use of AI and sort of tech innovation to maybe do more of the talent attraction. That's a real problem at the moment, just purely getting eyes glued on your sort of your EVP is proving to be incredibly difficult.
Do you think even so with the competition, do you think that will remain, or do you think that attraction will get easier because of that?
I think it's harder to stand out if you're an organization almost. It just brings me back, actually. Sorry, I appreciate I'm going off slight topic, but I looked at a fascinating piece of research. We looked at like job descriptions. Okay. And it looked at almost all of the S&P 100, so massive international organizations. The vast majority of their job descriptions, for example, included things like organizational information like company culture, business unit descriptions, almost every single one of them, some company benefits, why you'd want to work here. But as you can imagine, they're quite tightly aligned. They're very similar to actually split hairs between this company, but it's actually quite tough. A lot of them provided very limited information about sort of personal trajectory, career development, as I mentioned a moment ago, and that type of thing. Yeah, I think this type of thing will need to change if you're going to want to stand out. You know, people can aggregate jobs fairly easily these days and look at different opportunities. If you want to stand out, I think it's going to have to be more than just a reassertion of your company values. There's going to be, I think, a reconsideration needs to be made there. Just conscious, I haven't really answered your question in terms of the broader context. Not keen on sort of peering into my crystal ball.
That's okay. Well, why don't we rephrase it in a slightly different way then? So
yeah, sure.
Maybe looking at, we've mentioned AI already, but maybe looking at what's happening with candidates and there being lots available in the market. Do you think that if we were to see the situation leveling out, do you think that people over the course of the next 12 months will actually hang tight in organizations, and so we'll see less talent mobility? Or do you think that we're going to see an increase still in people moving around once things settle down? People, and similarly after COVID, when we had nobody moved for 2 years because nobody knew what was happening in the market. Obviously, that's obviously a huge generalization. But then, as soon as things felt a little bit more secure, people were ready and they were moving around. Do you think we'll see a similar situation to that?
I think we're gonna be in, again, I'm sorry, I'm gonna sound quite bleak. I think we're just gonna have a couple of years of what should we call it? Market uncertainty, I think, and it's purely from economic factors. I can't sort of peer into my crystal ball and predict the long-term future, but I think you're absolutely right. When there was the highest degree of sort of uncertainty with the whole COVID sort of the lockdown and the restrictions and stuff, there was very little movement. Then we had a sudden, the employer, it really did become an employee market overnight, with people going, I'm going to do what I want and I'm going to work wherever I want. And that was quite nice to see. It was quite refreshing for a bit. And then obviously we've sort of, I think, like politics, talent acquisition is Newtonian. It's kind of with every action, equal and opposite reaction. It's like that kind of Newton's cradle, sort of this. But I think it's slowed down. I don't think we're going to see the level of confidence in job hopping or moving, talent mobility, as you refer to it. Don't think we'll see it to the same degree, but I would love to see an increase in it from those that are currently employed, because it would imply, by extension, that the economy, things are sort of leveling out, things are improving gradually. I say that, but I wouldn't want to see it necessarily for really early careers people, because I think it's a different metric then. If you're seeing loads of grads who are 1 year into their career moving, that's normally not a good thing.
Negative indicator there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time, but do you have 10 minutes longer for us to go into our final topic?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous. So we've talked a lot about movement of candidates, where they might move around. A big factor in that we're finding is actually remote versus flexible versus hybrid versus in person. The market, everything has changed in terms of how and where people work, and it's impacting where people would want to work. So it's now a company benefit, essentially.
Yeah.
So do you think that will be a factor in what happens over the next year or so, is with more people trying to be drawn back into the office? Do you think that will impact movement around?
I think it will, and it's going to be very interesting, this one. It's kind of almost, you want to break out the popcorn, and I say that, I know it sounds very facetious of me, and I'm obviously an independent, and I can, well, coming to you live from my study in my house, so it's easy for me to say. I looked at a little bit of research in the build up to this, and it's not. It's really, it's not a simple mathematical equation almost to work it out, because of course some organizations are they've talked about bringing people back because of a productivity piece, but then productivity implies the bottom line being affected. Of course, that's why we measure productivity. But if you're saving lots and lots of money on things like very expensive leases on buildings and office space and things of that nature, then you have to also factor that into the equation as well. And you've got lines being drawn in the sand of Spotify. I think they made a very interesting. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes,
the kind of the ad. Yeah, the advert. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's, our employees aren't children; they can work from wherever they want. Yeah. Other organisations taking a different tact, and if I may, some with a lot less tact than you might expect, which is more or less demanding. So some of the sort of the major banking and financial investment organizations demanding 5-day working weeks back in the office. Now it is a difficult one, because again, it brings me back to what I said at the start. You can't force the genie back into the bottle, and once you've given employees a taste of working remotely, gaining so much of their time back, and demonstrating that they're able to do a job effectively, any sort of call back to the office will likely fall on deaf ears or be rejected resoundingly.
Well, funny you should say that. So I had a conversation with doing these interviews with the HR director for L3Harris. So we discussed this exact thing, and she used the example of their policy. So they were remote, obviously. Lots of people had to be. And actually, they decided they were going back to 3 days in the office. And we discussed on, actually, if you were to ask people to come back into the office, the split between those who didn't want to go back and those who came back, do you think that actually that could simmer down to culture as well? So there's a couple of different facets with it. It's the culture of the company. Are those people who decide that they don't want to go back to that? Could it be that actually they're good at the job but don't necessarily want to be part of the culture?
Yeah.
And then because you cultivate that culture by being with people, or is it actually that, like you said, that people have flexibility in their life now, so it's just it's a hard and fast no. If I don't have it, I'm not going to work there because I can't afford that in my life anymore. And
the real, you're absolutely right, and I don't want to paint a simplistic view of it, but it's horses for courses, ultimately what people want, and also what life stage they're at. So if we think about, if you've got young children and you're a family unit and then you're being pulled straight back to an office, that is a very good reason to start looking for a new employer, especially if you can do a job 100% remotely, because again, you've got the demonstrated course sort of track record of doing it. The last few years, you've worked remotely because of COVID restrictions. Don't tell me I can't do this job anywhere else. But I take your point. Some people really enjoy the culture of an organization. I do think it speaks to what kind of life stage in your career stage you're at, really.
Yes.
Because I can't say this without sounding like a complete sort of misanthrope, if you like. But I've got a busy life, I've got a company, and I do, I've got all these different things going on. For me at this stage, also ingratiating myself into a culture of, say, 500 staff would be really difficult. I don't think I'd be able to do it well. But if I went back to when I was 22 and I first landed in London, that's all I wanted to do. I wanted to be part of a company culture. And it's just kind of, I've just evolved over time. Now, obviously, speaking just to my own experience, you can't track that and scale it to everyone.
I was going to say, it's interesting you say that, because when obviously you've got a particular passion for graduates, in that conversation I mentioned, I asked actually about the difference in career sort of, don't know what you want to say, career progression, or where people are in their careers and their seniority. Actually, is there a difference? And she said she has seen a difference. So graduates or early careers typically, because it's been a few years since COVID now, a lot of them have never had to do the 9 to 5 grind in the office where you get up, you get to work, and you fit your life around it. And there's an argument of, do you think, I suppose we're going off on a bit of a tangent, because the younger generation of the workforce, they don't necessarily want to go into the office because they have never had to. On the one hand, do you think that's going to limit their development because they've not gone in and they've learned from people? But do you also think that it potentially impacts not necessarily their resilience, that would be unfair to say, but their ability to just trudge through, because you just have to, you just go in, you get it done, and you leave, you go and you fit everything else around it? Do you think there's almost an unwillingness to be flexible for an employer now? Not necessarily that it's a bad thing.
I do agree with that. I mentioned, and I'm going to sound a combination. I'm going to sound a little bit like dad and a little bit like an aggressive teacher. I think that you have to earn it. Yeah, and sorry, I know how that sounded like a school teacher then, but again, I'll speak to my own experiences. When I first started as a business psychologist, I worked round the clock delivering assessment centers, being front facing, meeting with clients, shaking hands with very senior people, interviewing very senior candidates, delivering psychometrics. I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't done that. I wouldn't have the confidence to engage with people the way that I do. I wouldn't develop my skills by being supported by the people that are around me, much more senior people. So I've said I'm very passionate about graduate hiring, but I dare say graduates listening to this might then start to dislike me when I'm about to say what I'm about to say. But I think that when you start your career, you do need to cut your teeth and you do need to be in the office. And elements of it, excuse my phrase, it's going to suck. Some of it will suck, but the things that I learned when I was 22, because I stayed on to do a master's, I still work with now. I still get up at 6 a.m. before 6 a.m. to go to the gym because I need to get to the office for 8. I still do that even though I work from home. I assure you, I would still be sat on the sofa now if I had never learned those things. And again, I appreciate I sound really like a stuffy old man right now, but I think you do need to learn it. And I think that it was just roll of the dice for me in my career. The COVID restriction and the reconsideration just happened at a good time. It would have been awful if it had happened when I was very junior. I think if I was 1 year into my career and then I got, I got put on furlough or I was working remotely, it would have been really bad for me. It would have been really bad. Luckily, I was kind of mid-senior level when it happened. About 7 to 8 years experience. So I could just go, okay, I'll just do it from home. Now I can interview people over the phone. I can hold these sessions. I can do these psychometric tests, but I've learned how to do that. Sorry, I sound like I'm telling off a child that isn't in the room. No. But I think when you're junior, I'd embrace it and embrace the culture. I remember working in the city, trying to keep my head above water. In terms of everything's very expensive. You're paying your rent, all this kind of stuff. It's not a long-term strategy, but cut your teeth.
You learn a lot.
You learn so much more than you'll learn so much more than you'll ever know. So when people
until 10 years down the line,
and then but then you've got the skills to make a decision, and then go, well, actually, I want to pivot, and I like that phrase again, without turning this into kind of a self-help podcast. Is there's no solutions, there's compromises. What are you willing to compromise?
Yeah.
And without coming down on the side of the the people who want all of their stuff back 5 days a week, unfortunately, if your compromise is I'm willing to compromise a lot of those comforts to push organizational productivity, it will probably work for you. But you've also got to inherit the compromise of people will probably start looking elsewhere.
So how do you think this will impact the employers and how people move, because there's an argument, like you said, that you've got someone who's very, very skilled. It might just be that that's not their preference. I appreciate, obviously, there's so many other scenarios that we're not really covering, like young parents, or where it's just not financially viable to commute to the office. So you may have got a job during lockdown and you're in Scotland, but your job is in London. It's just absolutely not viable for you to commute to the office. Yeah, exactly. And there are those scenarios, but if employers are making this decision, whether or not they want to go to hybrid flexible working or 5 days in the office, how what would your approach be, or how would you recommend making that decision to make the choice between potentially losing really high performing members of your team that might not want that versus increasing productivity or getting that culture that you really want to develop?
Yeah, I think it has to be a really careful. Blanket anything in any direction probably won't work. And I appreciate, organizations are made up of people. We're all fallible, myself included, and we have to make decisions quickly. But I'm not going to name names because I might not have this right, but I understand some major organizations have made multiple demands back for a 5-day work week. And obviously the employees have just gone, nah, you're all right. That only does damage to an organization. There's no positive there. If you're trying to enforce a rule that's then not followed up on, it doesn't help anybody. I think a nuanced approach. The other end of the kind of the spectrum sort of frustrated me. I saw a number of organizations kind of not really thinking it through and going, this bit is mandatory, but you're flexible the rest of the time. But the mandatory bit is you have to be in the London office 1 day a week, and we're going to tell you which day it is. And it's a Tuesday. So now people obviously were like, in the COVID years, I've literally moved me and my entire family to North Wales. So what do you want me to do? But because, of course, they're trying to get back into it, you might go to the office and it's like, right, the technology doesn't work. The IT team aren't in the office because it's not their elected day. None of the lights are on. Nothing works because it's all been turned off for the last 2 years. I'm being facetious, but you know what I mean? You have to really plan it out, because if you make these errors in your sort of your forward planning, your employees, they probably won't let you know, but you'll know about it. And the issue that you've got is that it's always a competitive selling point now. Do I think you'll get more? I think hybrid will just be obviously the way forward. It already seems to be. I don't think that's much of a revelation from me, but I think you might get, I'm thinking for new employees, you might get contractually obligated for a certain amount of days. I've seen 5 in 10 models like that where there's flexibility, but you need to come together. I think it's very important for junior people as well. But I
don't see being able to go back
unless an organization can demonstrate unequivocally their productivity. Because again, I actually, I appreciate I'm coming down on the side of the candidates, but an organization is there. You don't have again, I'm going to sound like dad, sorry, but you don't have a right to a job, and an organization is there to make money for its various stakeholders. So if organizations are able to demonstrate unequivocally that 5 days in the week, in the office a week is far more productive, and now we're pushing past our competitors, things will change very quickly. I just don't think we're seeing it, and that's why we're seeing this kind of Spotify takes this position, this company takes that position, and everyone's kind of like, well, I haven't been yelled at yet to go back to the office, so I'm just going to keep on trucking. Until we get really hard metrics on this, I don't see a sea change. I certainly don't see going back to as it was.
No, definitely not. Well, I also think that there's an element of people aren't robots and people have lives outside of work. And actually, by giving that level of flexibility, and this is my opinion, is actually that people will work harder when you give them sort of the flexibility to manage their lives around work.
The consulting firm that I worked for at the time when it got announced, a lot of individuals commuted in from the wider area. So you had like Essex, Guildford, quite far out. These individuals were paying £6,000-7,000 a year on train fare. So effectively, by announcing work from home, you've given them a £7,000 pay rise. Like that. What they're gonna give it up in the name of organizational productivity. Humans respond to incentives, and I'm pretty sure that's not an incentive they're going to respond to. So I think a balanced approach for that, but it's always an interesting one for me. But I do think, if this goes out to and people see it from more early careers, is jump straight in. If you're early 20s and you're trying to build a career, do the really hard stuff. Because it will make you just exponentially better when you hit 30 and 40, etc. You'll just be so much further ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So with all of that then, based on your experience, the clients you work with, what you would want personally and what we've seen, would we just, I don't know, 5 days in the office, would we make the bold statement and that's dead, and actually that all round is better just to have a flexible working policy? And that might impact the market better.
Yeah, 5 days for the sake of 5 days, I think, is dead, and I would hope it would be. It's just another version of presenteeism, isn't it? But it does depend on the individual. I think employers have absolutely every right to turn around and say this particular person does not work well remotely. And again, it might speak to the need to just do better performance management internally. But I mean, there's that guy, I saw it on LinkedIn the other day. Somebody said, "Come back to office." The caption was, "Come back to the office for the culture," and it's just the culture : and it's just a picture of just like your classic cubicle. Everything's grey. Everything's grey, and you're thinking, well, these people have got husbands and wives, they've got partners, girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever it may be, pet dog, pet cat, whatever, kids. Not in that order. They've got families, they've got lives, and you're telling them they should be excited about giving all of that up. Plus a horrible commute. I mean, I commuted in London on the Northern Line for 10 years. I'll never get that time back. And I've never wanted to revisit it either. But you have to be realistic. You can't just say, we'll change all that for the organizational culture. It's not gonna strike an appropriate chord.
No, definitely not. So before we sign off, do you have any closing statements? If you were to get your crystal ball, or if you were to make any statements that maybe if we chatted later in the year, so if we were to touch base in November, would you have any statements that you would want to reflect on back in November, December, if we touch base later?
I would really love to see some inroads being made on the parts of the assessment process for any individual from entry level all the way up that we know simply have not been working. So the revision of CV, cover letters, fealty questions in application forms, this type of thing being evaluated. I'd love to change things about the nature in which you can one-click apply to things, but you can't do that in a year. I'm not Superman. But I would love it if we just took this opportunity for a breath of fresh air and just sort of sat down and said, we can really do something different here. I mean, that's what we're trying to do at Merrio Talent. We're trying to just see the wood for the trees once more, and then look at how AI can be integrated in a more effective way. You can't run away from it, but I think right now we're still very much, it's percolating. Okay, it's not percolating to the surface. It is here, but it's still a formative step. Gartner, for example, have those hype cycles and things of that nature. There's disillusionment going on already with various uses of AI, but there's so much excitement around the possibilities. So be interested to see that, and I think it will go more into the simplifying the process so you can do more of the face-to-face stuff.
Yep, makes complete sense.
That might have not been a particularly coherent sort of summary statement, but there we go.
No, I'd be really interested to actually see a Gartner hype model graph of AI, because it'd be like development board, development board, development board. It would just be like this.
It's interesting because I used to be a seat holder. We used to have a seat years ago, and it's really interesting seeing it because you see this stuff kind of crop up, and this is the the really big thing, and then like 6 months to a year later, it's just like, oh no, that didn't work. We'll pretend that didn't happen, and then it's kind of it's not completely perfect, but it's a great way of looking at measuring sort of temperature of interest in certain things, if you like. That's a really simplistic way of looking at it, but it's fascinating to see the way the landscape is shifting.